Topic Notes 5.4 Invertebrates Part 2. And this picture is of one of my favorite invertebrate groups, which is Echinodermata. And this is a cushion star, which are awesome animals that we have in our local area. Our main idea here is that invertebrates include some of the most diverse animal groups on the planet, and they exhibit a vast range of adaptations and play critical roles in the marine environment. And of course, this time we are going to be looking at some very important ones. We're going to be looking at crustaceans, we're going to be looking at echinoderms, and that will set the stage. So let's get started. Well, I'm here to tell you folks that we humans are far vastly outnumbered. We are going to start with Superphylum Arthropoda, which is a huge phylum, includes 75% of all known species on the planet. And if you just look at insects alone, they outnumber us 200 million to 1. Yes, this is a very powerful and amazing group, and we're going to start learning about them. Now let's just look at the term. Arthro means joint, and podus is foot, so jointed feet, or jointed appendage is essentially what we're looking at. And that's one of the biggest characteristics that we have, chitinous exoskeleton. Essentially, it's like Iron Man, right? They have this hard exoskeleton that protects them from the outside world. And this not only provides protection, but it also provides support and attachment points for muscles. So if you are to state one major characteristic of this group, it is paired jointed appendages and an exoskeleton. Now, along with this exoskeleton comes some kind of needed characteristics. The body is divided into segments, specifically the head, the thorax, abdomen, and telson. And this is important because if you're going to have a hard exoskeleton, you have to be able to move it around to some degree, like a suit of armor. Now, this also provides some issues when it comes to growing because the exoskeleton doesn't grow, it's hard. But what you can do, or what arthropods do, is they actually continue to shed those exoskeletons and grow new ones. And that growth by molting or shedding of the old exoskeleton and forming a new one is very commonplace throughout the arthropods. Now, you can actually see a blue crab on the bottom image here kind of going through that process. Essentially, the new exoskeleton forms underneath the old one, and it's really soft at that point in time. And then the crab or the shrimp kind of wiggles its way out of the old exoskeleton. And now that crab or shrimp or whatnot, lobster, is a little bit vulnerable because the new exoskeleton is a bit soft. And they puff themselves up with water and kind of swell up to kind of stretch and make that new exoskeleton a little bit bigger than the previous exoskeleton was. And it hardens. And then once it hardens, there they go. They're back to where they should be, being protected by that exoskeleton. So another thing, of course, they do have an open circulatory system. They are triploblastic, so they have all 3 germ layers, and they are protostomes. So that first opening in the blastopore is going to be the mouth. Now, so far, we've only looked at general characteristics of this mega superphylum Arthropoda. Now, as that big mega superphylum Arthropoda might suggest, there is quite a lot of diversity. And so we're going to jump into looking at a few of those. And up first is the trilobite, Subphylum Trilobitomorpha. Now, these are really awesome animals that are no longer with us. In fact, they went extinct towards the end of the Permian about 252 million years ago, but they had a big track record. They existed in our oceans for almost 270 million years with over 20,000 species between them. Obviously, that means they have left a pretty good imprint on the fossil record, which is why I mention them, because you might see them out and about places. However, we're not going to worry about them too much here. Next up is Subphylum Chelicerata, which actually has to do with chelicera, which are these little pincers that this group has. And there are some well-known examples like spiders and scorpions. But for the marine environment, we talk about horseshoe crabs, which are, again, one of my favorites to talk about. They are really neat. Unlike trilobites, they are still in existence. We can find them in our Lake Worth Lagoon right now, and they have been around for more than 300 million years, making them even older than dinosaurs. It's actually kind of neat. And they've got a really lot of cool adaptations as well to look at. However, we'll move on for the moment. Another one on the far right you'll notice is a sea spider, Echinodermata, and this is a really interesting critter. They can exist in various different sizes. I've actually seen quite a few on the small size in coastal waters. In deep waters they can get a little bigger, and they're really, really kind of interesting. But again, this is not a group that we're going to be talking about in depth. I just want to introduce you to these concepts. Now, the taxonomy of Superphylum Arthropoda can get a little bit tedious. We are going to keep it pretty simple, so I'm just going to introduce you to certain groups. And this is a group called the Mandibulates, and there are 3 subphylums within this group. There is subphylum Crustacea, which is what we are going to spend the most of our time actually studying because they have to do with marine mandibulates, like crabs and shrimps. You can see the picture up at the top. Then we have subphylum Hexapoda, which would be our insects, and subphylum Myriapoda, which would be your millipedes and centipedes. For obvious reasons, being a marine class, we're going to focus on crustaceans specifically, but the rest of them have a lot of awesome tales to be told as well. So let's focus in on those crustaceans because that is what we are going to be spending our time with and what's going to be assessed here. And their major characteristics, they have what we call biramous appendages, split near the base into 2 branches, so essentially 2 parts, They also have 2 paired antennae and 3 pairs of mouth parts, mandibles, and 2 sets of maxilla. You can actually get all crafty with these and separate them all out and learn them. We're just going to understand that they're there. Mandibles are sort of the bigger, bulkier ones that help do some of the grinding, and the maxilla sort of helps sweep and control the food as it comes in. Now, when we look at the body, now we've already mentioned some of these terms before when we talked about arthropods in general, and now we're focusing in specifically on crustaceans. The body is divided into 2 regions, the cephalothorax, which is a combination head and thorax, and it also has the heart, gills, and stomach inside of that region. There's what we call the carapace, which is the part of the exoskeleton that protects that dorsal side of the cephalothorax. So these are all terms you need to know. The second part or region, of course, would be the abdomen. So within crustaceans, there is order Decapoda, and this is where most of the animals we know and we study in the marine environment exist. They're shrimp, crayfish, lobsters, and crabs. They generally are characterized by having 5 pairs of walking legs. The first pair are cheelheads, which are the pincers that capture prey. They are scavengers, they are predators, they are deposit, and even filter feeders. So there's quite a few variety. All 3 shown in the picture below are from our local area. We have our giant hermit to the left, we have our coral banded shrimp in the middle, and our Caribbean spiny lobster on the right. So let's talk reproduction. Usually crustaceans tend to be dioecious, so they're male and female counterparts. They're modified appendages for mating, and that helps deliver the sperm, usually in what we call spermatophores, to the female. Now, the females carry the eggs in what we call a brood chamber, and you can see that on the far right, this sort of big kind of orangey thing. Those are a bunch of eggs, and you can tell male and female blue crabs, for example, apart by the size of their abdomens. The female has a wider abdomen because she's got to carry that big brood chamber, whereas the males don't need it. They're much more narrow abdomen. Now, from eggs, of course, they hatch out, and we have larval stages that are planktonic. Now, the first larval stage we'll talk about is the nauplius. Now, this is the distinctive first larval stage for crustaceans in general, and you'll often find quite a few of them in plankton toes. Then we go to the zoea larvae, which is very much more specific to crabs, things like that. Then we have the megalopa as the crab is getting kind of more like its adult self. You can sort of see it take shape. And then, of course, the juvenile over on the far right. From there, they're going to be settling out on the benthic surface somewhere on mud or seagrasses or whatever, rocks, and start to develop into their adult form. So in every family group, right, there's got to be some oddball, and that would be class Cirripedia for the crustaceans. These are your barnacles, and they are very strange. They're the only sessile crustaceans, meaning that they can't move around once they settle down as their adult form. Most have a calcium carbonate shell that they use to protect themselves, and they attach directly to hard surfaces, or sometimes have a stalk for attachment as well, like gooseneck barnacles. Now, they are filter feeders, which is why they like to hitch rides on sea turtle shells and whales, because it takes them where the plankton is for filter feeding. Now, they tend to be hermaphroditic, so they can kind of go both ways, depending on the situation, but they can't self-fertilize. So they actually cross-fertilize using long, extendable penises. Kind of interesting, but essentially think of it this way. Barnacles, once they settle, they can't move. So their only reproductive partner is going to be whoever is within reach of their extendable penis. So they actually have one of the largest members of the animal kingdom, by ratio, that is. But it's effective for their situation. Now that we've gained some scope on the diversity of crustaceans and arthropods in general, let's talk about their ecological importance. So first of all, they are scavengers, and this is crucial in the recycling of mineral nutrients. So they are detritivores, and they accelerate decomposition, which is really important. They form many symbiotic relationships, for example, cleaner shrimp, parasites, barnacles, things like that. They also graze on epiphytic algae and maintain the health of seagrasses. So in coastal regions, they're really important. And they are major food sources for many organisms. Remember, we told you 75% of all animal life is essentially an arthropod. Well, they're also food for a lot of organisms. So that helps produce a lot of protein and other nutrients that go up into the different trophic levels. So they're very important, especially as larval forms in the ocean. Now, from an economic standpoint, they're also important. They're important for the commercial fishing industry for larger crustaceans such as shrimps, krill, crabs, crayfish, and lobsters. The smaller zooplankton also support the seafood that we harvest, including a lot of fish. So they're very important in that realm as well. Krill is often used in aquaculture and in aquarium food. I often have some in my freezer at school. Now, crustaceans can pose problems with aquaculture, which is essentially farming in the ocean. Water fleas, which are a type of crustacean, consume smaller zooplankton needed to feed juvenile fish. And fish lice, which are also copepods, are parasites to fish, so that can cause problems. So let's talk a little bit about krill, because they are critically important and a good case study. So copepods and krill are crucial trophic components to the marine food chain. Krill form about 110 billion kilograms of biomass in just the Southern Ocean alone. And krill have reproductive capacities that are incredibly high. Females can lay up to 10,000 eggs and produce swarms of 30,000 individuals. This is really incredibly important for, again, supporting multiple trophic levels above them. They're also that nice transition between the phytoplankton and the upper trophic levels as well. Increased sunlight and nutrients in the spring can lead to massive phytoplankton blooms that can feed krill and cause their populations to bloom as well. Now, global climate change essentially can impact krill. It can increase ocean temperatures, and this increase or change in ocean currents can reduce the amount of Arctic sea ice as well. And when we talk about commercial fishing, krill are a very big target. Over 20 million kilograms annually are harvested globally. This leads to a decrease in krill populations. reducing grazing on phytoplankton, then you have larger plankton blooms, and some of that can lead to toxic algae as well. Overfishing of predators such as squid can cause a dramatic variations within the krill abundance up and down. Now it's time for the echinoderms. And if you break the Greek down, echinos is spiny plus derma skin, ada to bear, so to bear spiny skin. And of course, the sea urchin right here is a great example of that. But they don't always look like spiny skinned animals as well. So let's get into it. Now, when we talk about basic characteristics for phylum Echinodermata, the water vascular system and tube feet are key. The water vascular system is essentially a network of water vessels that are operated by a hydraulic pressure system. This is really kind of usually symbolized with the sea stars. However, they are found in all the echinoderms, where you take in water. In this case, if you look at the graphic on the right, you'll see a term called madrepore. That's the little outer kind of orifice in which water enters the system. Then it goes down through what we call the stone canal into the ring canal, and then out lateral canals to the different legs of the sea star. And then from there, they go out to individual tube feet. And you can see the tube feet on the left there centered. They're all extending down, and they can basically blow up with water pressure, stick onto something, and then retract by retracting that water pressure back. That kind of a thing. Very cool system. Now, they do have a calcareous endoskeleton, which again seems weird because they feel hard when you touch them, but they usually have a layer of tissue over that endoskeleton. So that's why it's an endoskeleton. Adults have what we call pentaradial symmetry, which means they're essentially in a circle. And you can see that exactly with things like sea urchins and sea stars. They look like they're kind of circular in their symmetry. However, spherical, if you will, they do have larvae, however, that are bilateral in symmetry, which is kind of interesting, and I'll get into that in a minute. They are triploblastic, so they have 3 tissue layers, but here is our first deuterostome critter. Deuterostomes, remember from embryology, as that first blast pore forms during gastrulation, that opening will either form a mouth or an anus. And in this case, for deuterostomes, that first hole forms the anus. So that is what first forms for the sea star. And here's an interesting one to entertain your friends at parties. Guess who else is a deuterostome? Yep, humans. We are. So we share that with sea stars and echinoderms in general. Now, you can't talk about echinoderms without talking about how they feed, especially sea stars. With sea stars, their stomach, well, they actually have 2 layers of stomach, the pyloric and cardiac stomach, but either way, their stomach can be inverted inside out and thrust out of their body and into the prey animal that they're eating. So in that first picture on the left, bottom left there, you can see this kind of gelatinous thing coming out of the mouth of the sea star. That is its stomach, and it will stick it inside, for example, the clam on the right, and start to digest the prey before it actually takes it into its body. So it starts to digest the prey inside the prey's body, inside the shell. Very interesting and somewhat disturbing considering they're digesting them alive. Now, I mentioned that bilateral larvae. This is where that comes in. So evolutionary-wise, there's a possible common ancestor with chordates here because they are deuterostomes, meaning that blast pore forms an anus first instead of a mouth, so they actually belong to kind of more complex organisms. And we think they probably split somewhere around, from chordates at least, somewhere around 600 million years ago. So we're not talking very common or close relatives at all. This is a long time ago. But what's interesting is we think the radial symmetry we see in the adults was actually secondarily derived from bilateral ancestors. This is different than when we look at things like cnidarians, for example, or ctenophores that have radial symmetry. Those have radial symmetry throughout. In case of echinoderms, they had bilateral symmetry probably in their past and then developed radial symmetry secondarily. Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time here, but I do want to make some connections. Now, we talked earlier on when we talked about classifications about clades and cladograms, things like that. This is sort of in that vein. So when we look at ancestral animals and where things split or diverged based on the critters that we've talked about so far, for the most part, this graphic gives you that sort of breakdown. First of all, you had probably what we would consider your ancestral protists, or single-celled organisms. Somewhere back in there, we had sponges split off and do their own thing, and they have continued to devolve into modern animals. They're modern, they're not, whatever, but they have very different structure than everything else. Then we had the development of what we call true tissues. And we had kind of a split there between the radiata, which would be your cnidarians and ctenophores, and your bilateral or triploblastic animals that became your protostomes and deuterostomes farther along. Now, again, there are some studies looking at ctenophores and whether or not they belong there or not, if they actually were more ancestral before that. So this is not a done deal in terms of this graphic. It's just sort of an idea. Then we have, again, those protostomes and deuterostomes, where that split, you have your annelids, arthropods, mollusks, platyhelminthes, which are flatworms, and nematodes, roundworms, go off into one side, and then your deuterostomes would be your echinoderms and chordata. There's also something called bryozoa, which I haven't talked to you guys about yet, but that's just whatever. So echinoderms and chordata sort of are on their own developmental path through that lane. So this just kind of gives you these evolutionary connections that we have so far with the data and the information we have as of now. Now let's take a little romp through the diversity of the echinoderms in general. And we're going to start with class Astrodia, which would be our sea stars. You know them, you love them. They're carnivores, they're scavengers. They actually have two forms of reproduction, asexual and sexual. Interestingly enough, if you cut the sea star in half and it's got optimum conditions, it will form two identical sea stars, and genetically at least, that kind of thing. The central nerve cord needs to be intact in whatever fragments. This kind of sort of threw some fishermen off back in the day because sea stars go after mollusks and mussels and things like that, which are harvested by fishermen. They thought if they went and started chopping up the sea stars and throwing them back in the ocean, that would solve their problem, because then they would have more mussels to actually collect for humans, because there'd be less sea stars out there. Well, the joke was on the fishermen, because they basically quadrupled the number of sea stars because all of the fragments started asexually reproducing. Interesting. Class Ophiuridae are the brittle stars and the basket stars. Now these look like, well, the far right looks like a sea star, but kind of skinny, noodly one, right? But the basket stars on the left there are very much more alien looking, and they don't even look like they're an animal, but they are, and they're very cool. They are carnivores, scavengers, deposit feeders, and filter feeders. Then we have our class Echinoidea, or our sea urchins, sand dollars, and sea biscuits. They are grazers, they're deposit feeders, they're scavengers. Some will eat animal material for sure. I have some in my tanks that do. They have external fertilization, so their little larvae get kind of plopped out into the water. Hopefully they meet and fertilize and become little baby larvae, echinoderms, and sea urchins and whatnot. We have class Holothuridae. This would be our sea cucumbers, and these are the great vacuum cleaners of the sea. They go around deposit feeding and picking up all of the dead organics and pooping it out the other side. In fact, all the little sand tubes you see lying around the reef are generally from sea cucumbers, and most of the sand that you've ever been on at the beach or in the water or anywhere has all been processed through sea cucumbers, probably quite a few times. Class Crinoidea would be our crinoids, sea lilies, and feather stars. Interesting story with these guys. We thought these stock crinoids specifically were extinct. And lo and behold, in the deep ocean, we found live ones. So sometimes the fossil record shows us things, but we just haven't found the living ones yet. And that was the case with crinoids. So let's talk about the importance of echinoderms in terms of ecology. Now, they are a food source for a few species, some sea otters, spider crabs, things like that. Triggerfish will get after them. They are major predators, however, of other invertebrates, and that's really where they kind of, especially sea stars specifically, fall into play. Now, urchins, on the other hand, tend to control algae growth. In fact, we found this out to our detriment in the diadema long-spined urchins in the Caribbean. Essentially were practically wiped out by a disease, and we noticed a marked decrease of health of reefs because the algae started overgrowing the reefs. They are to this day protected and have come back in population. I actually see them quite often out there now. So let's talk a few examples here. The coral reefs, for example, there is a thing called the crown of thorns sea starfish or sea star, and by the way, the more proper way to say things are sea stars because they are not fish, but you'll see it interchangeably everywhere. Now, the crown of thorns is a keystone species. They feed on the fastest growing coral species, and this supports the colonization of slower growing species. So if you think about it, if you have fast growing species coral dominating, the slower growing coral would never have a chance. So that predation of the crown of thorns on the faster growing coral allows the longer coral to actually make inroads into the reef. This increases coral biodiversity and generally helps provide further and more diverse niches in the reef itself. Now, reduction of predators can lead to an explosion of crown of thorns, which actually would flip things the other way. It would be an overall reduction of reef biodiversity. So you need that kind of right balance of the number of crown of thorns. And of course, there's the age-old tale from the kelp forest, where sea urchins feed on kelp holdfasts. And of course, the urchins are predated by sea otters. Overhunting of sea otters decreased the urchin population. Then, of course, they destroyed the kelp forest, that kind of a thing. And then as we increased urchin predation, this can help cause kelp to overrun the ecosystem. So if you have too many urchins or too little urchins, again, it can off-balance the system. You want just the right amount. That's what that ecological balance means. Now, on sandy shores, sea cucumbers are a big deal. They help filter seawater. They burrow into the substrate, and that provides oxygen. They also provide planktonic larvae that help support planktivores, or fish that eat plankton. And they ingest a lot of sand with a lot of that organics in the sediment and help to essentially recycle nutrients. Now, from an economic perspective, let's look at how this breaks down. Crown of thorns, for example, they can damage ecotourism or benefit depending on the balance of the number of the population. Sea cucumbers are considered a delicacy in Chinese culture, so they're being harvested in great numbers. For example, in the Galapagos, there really were no controls for quite a long time, and there was an 80% decrease in the population. In 1999, they started to implement regulations, seasons, and minimum catches to basically mitigate some of that. Unfortunately, most of those regulations didn't really have much effect until about 2005 when enough of a collapse essentially in sea cucumbers caused a decrease in income from the fisheries, and thus all of a sudden they started to pay attention to things. Sea cucumbers are also a source of pharmaceutical drugs that so we've already touched on this a little bit, but essentially the natural world, it has a lot of different chemicals in it, and we can utilize those chemicals for medicines if we look in just the right places and study just the right things. And that, folks, is all we have. So make sure you pay attention to those learning goals. And of course, until next time, keep learning.